Hi there, this is Llorana from Llorana Films, and welcome to another double take. Today's double take is about 1930s Mexican horror films. These were both released from Indicator recently. This is La Llorona from 1933, directed by Ramon Peon, and then The Phantom of the Monastery from 1934, directed by Fernando de Fuentes. These are somewhat of a departure from Indicator, but if they're going to do more films like this, I'm super excited for that. These are the kind of films that perhaps Flicker Alley would release. Mexican cinema is certainly a blind spot for me, and I'm sure it is for quite a few people outside of like the films Louis Buñuel did in Mexico, for example. But these films are pretty astonishing. We'll start with La Llorona from 1933. This is, the name will probably be familiar because there's been at least a dozen different film adaptation of the La Llorona myth. It seems like there's been about at least half a dozen in the last 10 years or so. And this is one of the oldest kind of Mexican myths, which dates back to even the Spanish invasion of Mexico. And it's basically the story of a woman who is wronged, who kills her child or her children, and then kills herself and comes back as a ghost, either taking vengeance on children, but the myth has kind of morphed into she has become kind of a avenger for children in some adaptations, and less of a monster. It's interesting, with the exception of maybe The Bride of Frankenstein, La Llorona is maybe the first kind of female monster or female ghost that has spawned sequels and remakes galore. So a little bit of background: Mexican cinema, they had a silent period, but it wasn't that long, and then La Llorona is pretty much the first sound horror film. So what happened, as we know, Dracula and Universal in 1931, Hollywood, because of sound, they couldn't export their films to lots of countries if it was in English, so they made kind of Spanish versions or Hispanic versions of films using Latino actors and technicians. So for example, they shot another version of Dracula alongside the Bela Lugosi one, which is an interesting watch in itself. But Mexican audiences, Spanish speaking audiences, kind of went off that idea pretty quickly because they didn't have the star power of the American versions, the Hollywood versions of those films. So that was kind of scrapped, but those actors and technicians went back to Mexico and Venezuela and Cuba and made their own films and built their own industries up. So for example, like 1931 in Mexico, there's only like 6 films made, but by the time 1933 comes along, there's 20 odd films made, and the Mexican film industry kind of builds from there. So that's kind of the background, which is explained a lot better on the special features. Um, so for both these films, you get a Kim Newman and Stephen Jones commentary, which is excellent as always. You get a 17-minute supplement on Larona Ghosts of the Past, which is a documentary by the great granddaughter of the producer of this film, which again is fascinating about the background. And you have a piece on transcending time, where Abraham Castillo Flores, who's a head programmer, film programmer in Mexico, and he does a piece on both films, which are which are both excellent about the background, about the filmmaking, and like I said, he explains the kind of history a lot better than I did. So the supplements in these films are wonderful as well. The prints are really good. The print for Phantom in the Monastery is probably a little bit better. That was done by UCLA. I think George Lucas was involved with that. But this is still a 2K restoration. It's a film from 1933, and it's a really nice print. So this version of the Larona, which is certainly the first talkie version, is in the present day, but it also goes back to the conquistadors, and also it goes back maybe like 100 years, and there's iterations of the same legend, and in the present day there's this hooded figure that does nefarious things, and it becomes a kind of murder mystery after we kind of see the flashbacks of the iterations of the La Llorona character, the origin story, where she came from. So again, you could argue it's the first kind of feminist monster, again, apart from maybe Bride of Frankenstein, as far as it's a character who is wronged by a class system, because she has, there's lots of history involved, because the original La Llorona may have come back from a slave girl that was given to the conquistadors, to Cortes, who then had a child with Cortes and then was shunned. She is kind of viewed as a betrayer of Mexico, and also a heroine of Mexico. It's complicated. Technically, these films are really impressive, and I would say they're perhaps even more impressive from a technical standpoint than their British and American counterparts. Certainly the acting, especially in The Phantom of the Monastery, I would say is generally better than the acting in British and American horror films at the time, because I think the American or Hollywood's view of the Universal monsters in general is more, oh, they're kids films, whereas these two films aren't really kids films, these are adult films, and the acting goes along with that. Some of the acting in British and American horror films at the time can be a bit ropey, to say the least. I mean, this one's only 70 minutes. It gets in and out pretty quickly, but it's effective. There's wonderful things involving hidden corridors and secret doors and passageways. And it's an effective wonderful little film with a lot of kind of historical baggage specifically to Mexico. But again, as they say, there's been iterations of the film in Venezuela and Cuba, and of the myth of the woman, because La Llorona translates as the wailing woman or the crying woman, who is looking for her lost children and is doomed to walk the earth looking for her lost children, or as different versions of happened, she becomes an avenger for children and women that are wronged. In this version, she kills her child with stabbing, but the myth seems to have changed, and it now has seemed to evolved into a drowning situation. And one wonderful moment, Abraham Castillo Flores talks about the versions that America have made of the film, and he's like, I'd rather not mention those ones. So that is a wonderful release. And then we come to the Phantom of the Monastery, which for me is probably the best indicator release for quite some time, and they have been knocking out the park with some of the releases. But this is an absolute stunner. Directed by Fernando de Fuentes, who, as Abraham Castillo Flores says, was known as the John Ford of Mexican cinema. He made 39 films. This one has a commentary. This is a 4K restoration, and it looks stunning. Again, this has a commentary with Kim Newman and Stephen Jones, and it has an 18-minute piece, The Devil in Detail, with Abraham Castillo Flores again, which is wonderful. And obviously it's a limited edition, so it has the booklet. This one is a really simple story. This one's 85 minutes long, and these are both Spanish with English subtitles. This is about 3 people, a husband and wife and their best friend, who are lost in the countryside and are led to a monastery where they spend the night, and strange things happen. That's it. But it is an absolutely jaw-dropping film, or I found it to be jaw-dropping. You do have to remind yourself that it's made in 1934, because it looks like a film that could have been made in the 40s or 50s. And you do kind of go, this is 1984, this is 1934, this is 88 years old, and it just looks stunning. From a technical standpoint, the tracking shots, the dolly shots, the cinematography is gorgeous. It was shot in a monastery, which still exists today, influenced by a set of monk mummies that are still in a museum somewhere. The film starts wonderfully, because one of the characters is digging themselves out a ravine. We don't know how you get into the ravine, and it's the husband, and there's a kind of dynamic between the 3 characters, the husband and the wife and the friend, which changes over the evening and then changes again by the time the sun rises. And again, Kim Newman and Stephen Jones do make the point that the actual characters, those 3 characters, are, and their relationship between each other is probably more complex than 99% of horror films since. And again, it's 1934, the Universal horror films, again, more kind of aimed at kids or young teenagers, whereas this film is strictly a film for adults, and the characters are dealing with adult things. But two things will really strike you about this film. One, the technical aspect. The cinematography is gorgeous, the use of light and shadow. but also the acting, because the acting is so good. Um, Again, there's none of that kind of ropey 30s, 40s acting that can sometimes be a little bit dodgy. Um, the acting is wonderful in the film. It has a tremendous sense of creepiness and dread. There's, at one point a bat shape appears in the wall, but they can't seem to find where it's coming from. They're walked past a room and somebody is either flailing somebody or being flailed themselves, and you can see a goatee beard, and it's like, that kind of looks like a depiction of the devil. At one point it seems that the monks are eating ashes. The reason that everybody seems to be a little bit on edge is because there's a door to one of the cells that is barred, and it has a large cross across the door to keep whatever's in. And we learn the origin of that room, which I won't go into, but there's a wonderful sign, very much like the entrance into hell in Dante's version, which is abandon all hope ye who enter. This is cursed be he who turns to flesh and forgets God. So I mean, the stuff in this, yes, in America it's 1934, so the Hays Code was just in, but this film goes way further than any British horror film or any American horror film of the 30s or 40s. The closest to it's probably a little bit like a Val Newton film, Jacques Tourneur film. It has that feel of kind of unease of these characters from the outside world coming into this strange world where it might be a different time or exactly what's going on. But it's such an adult film. And then what we actually see, as far as it's pretty creepy, and again, it gets away with showing a lot more than you would see in an American film or a British film at the time. Some of the imagery is actually quite creepy and quite disturbing. Again, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but it's an absolutely phenomenal film. La Llorona is really good, but The Phantom of the Monastery it's just an amazing film. And again, I keep repeating myself, but you will keep looking at the back of the box to say this was made in 1934, wasn't it? Because it looks absolutely stunning, and it's just so adult and kind of so ahead of its time if you compare it to its peers from other countries. The print, both prints are great, but the print on The Phantom of the Monastery is absolutely stunning. So if you're interested in Mexican cinema, learning more about Mexican cinema, if you're interested in the early roots of horror, I mean, you could easily see the Blind Dead films in The Phantom of the Monastery. These are two really influential films, and I do think that both these will probably sell out pretty quickly. So if you want the limited edition versions with the booklets, I would suggest you pick them both up. They're spine number 243 and 244, so they're a nice pair. But I do think these will sell out. The limited editions will sell out. Obviously, Indicator do release standard editions, because these are absolutely wonderful releases. And so far, I mean, I know it's only March, but these are two stunning releases by Indicator, and I hope it's maybe a sign of things to come. Obviously, I do like the work that Flicker Alley does, but I don't actually have that many Flicker Alleys. I think I've only got The Man Who Laughs. I know a friend of the channel, Roger Kirby, did a couple of videos on some Flicker Alley releases. The Beast Must Die, not the Amicus film, and Bitter Stems, I think. I mean, it would be great if Indicator could release more of these films themselves, because Flicker Alley is really expensive, even for boutique Blu-rays. They're pretty expensive. Yeah, but I would highly recommend, if you have any interest in the kind of subject matter or film history in general, I would highly recommend you picking these two up. Again, the limited editions are 2,000 copies each. I think I heard somewhere that generally there's about 1,000 copies that go on pre-orders for Indicator titles. So I would highly recommend picking these two up, especially The Phantom in the Monastery, because it's one of those stunning films. And again, Kim Newman and Stephen Jones actually say they had never seen it before, because it's one of those films that was perhaps lost and brought back. And as Mr. Flores says in the special features, there's so many of these films that sadly are now lost. But it is great that UCLA and other places can restore these little gems, because these aren't just like average films they've restored. These are really good, really influential, really important films, not only in Mexican cinema history, but in cinema history in general. Yeah, so thanks very much for watching this episode of Double Take. Hopefully that's inspired you to go pick these up, because they're special releases from Indicator. I know I'm biased, but these are really special. So thanks very much for watching. Hopefully you'll join me again for more Double Take videos. This is Solid Llorana from Solid Llorana Films, saying farewell.